Today. Welcome very much to the Commissariat store. As, some of you have been here many, many times, and others probably haven't so much. It's one of the two oldest buildings in Brisbane, convict built. The other one, of course, is the windmill. So we're very, very proud of this building. It's the home of the Royal Historical Society of Queensland. And if any of you are not members, you'd be very, very welcome to join. And just speak to any one of us. There's a number of us. Today we're going to be slightly different. Usually at these talks, we talk about somebody talking about some historical event in the past or historical person. Today we're very, very much up to date, looking at something that would be unthinkable 10, 20 years ago, which is the Atlas of Religion. And most of you are old enough to remember doing research pre-Trove and the fun of sitting over at the State Library scrolling through these things and going blind from it. And Trove came along and helped. The Atlas of Religion is doing much the same for people studying religion in Queensland. And it's a wonderful source. I have an item on there, and I've used it several times. And Dr. Geoff Ginn from the University of Queensland, who's very well known to most of us, is one of the founders, one of the two founders of the Atlas. He's going to talk to us today. We'll have about 20 minutes question and answer at the end. So if you have any questions, please hold on to them to the end. Okay? Thanks very much. Okay. Over to you, Geoff.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thanks everyone for that kind welcome. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the elders past, present and emerging. As Bill said, my name's Geoff Ginn. I'm a historian at the University of Queensland, and I'm really pleased to be talking about a project that we've been working on at the University of Queensland now for about 6 years. So it's been a slow train coming, and we've given a number of work in progress style talks, but we're now in the very happy position of being able to describe a completed project, the Queensland Atlas of Religion, that will continue into the future. So even though it's launched and now a live website, the important thing to emphasize is that it will continue to grow and expand. So really, as Bill said, I'm here to describe and introduce to you a brand new research resource. It's a public reference website. It's a website that focuses on the history and also on the contemporary diversity of religion in Queensland, particularly religious life. So it's an important distinction there. We're not here necessarily to define any specific religion or religions. We're here to show how people live in the community and how their religious experiences and their community experiences are very closely interconnected. So it's really about people and the way they live their lives. Except we've chosen to focus on the religious dimension that is important, has been important, and continues to be important in many people's lives. So this project, as you see there, Queensland Atlas of Religion, actually began when I drove past that building. I don't know if anyone's been down to towards Beaudesert, going along Logan Road down towards Beaudesert. As you go through South Maclean, you go over the Logan River. My daughter was rowing for a while, so I was often driving to Beaudesert, by Yarralong and so on. And on your right, as you're driving out towards Beaudesert, is this extraordinary piece of Indian architecture. It's a powerful, imposing landmark, and it's visually dramatic. It's obviously extremely well built. It's highly ornate. And I actually took this photograph that you see in the background there before we even conceived of this project, before we'd even really started developing it. And my initial instinct was there must be a great story behind that building. Why is that building so prominent in the landscape? And why is it, and how has it developed as a community hub? And it's essentially a Hindu temple. But as we go into it, I'll tell you a bit more about that Hindu temple. And there is an extraordinary story to tell about that landscape feature. It really is a landmark as you're going across the Logan River, through South Maclean and out towards Beaudesert. So the key thing is we wanted to do something that told the story, and we wanted to do something that captured a sense of that religious diversity in Queensland. We started off with, as all good ideas begin, it was a beer in the pub. My colleague Adam Bowles and I were talking about various things. I'm a historian. I work in 19th and 20th century British history, but also Australian and colonial history. Adam is a Sanskrit specialist. Now, if you want to define one of those founding intellectual disciplines in Western scholarship, it's the study of Sanskrit. It develops in the 18th century. on the basis of ancient Indian texts. And Adam was one of the few people in Australia to conduct PhD research in that, and he's now one of only 3 or 4 people in Australia who actually teaches it and works on ancient Indian literature, particularly the Mahabharata. And he's translating an edition of the Mahabharata, one volume in that epic Indian text. So Adam and people like him are often confronted with their own mortality in an academic sense, because they need to demonstrate that they're contributing, that they're generating students, that they have a vital study and research area to sustain their program. So I don't have that problem. Everyone loves history. Lots of students are still showing up for history courses. It's still a very popular and important part of the arts degree. Sanskrit, not so much. So poor old Adam had to give up his Sanskrit teaching about 10 years ago. Continues to teach it in his spare time. But essentially this project started when he and I put our heads together and started to think about how he might contribute some of his knowledge of Indian culture, Indian traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, to an understanding of contemporary Queensland, which is something he previously hadn't done. So I'm taking the roundabout kind of storytelling version here, describing where the project started, where it came from. But as it developed, we saw it as an opportunity for the history staff at UQ and associated researchers, together with the studies and religion staff at UQ and associated researchers, to come together. So in its first iteration, it begins as a collaboration between studies and religion and history at UQ. So as a result of that, there's an emphasis in our project on contemporary diversity, but also the history of diversity in the Queensland context. People are aware that we live in a multicultural society with many different religious communities represented, many different places of worship, many different community centres, temples, mosques, synagogues, and so on. What people are less aware of is that this is very much a feature of Queensland life going back historically too. So that's where the project began. And we set out with a series of objectives, if you like, which I can summarise in this slide. As it says there, we made a pitch to the Australian Research Council. We gained funding, initially seed funding from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at UQ. Through that seed funding, we ran a series of community workshops. We had 5 of them in the end. We had one in Toowoomba, one in Logan, one in Gladstone, one in Townsville, and one here at the State Library, South Brisbane. And from that, we developed a community reference group, and many people became aware of our project through those local workshops and signed up to be members of the community reference group in order to provide input to our terms of reference in our research. But the objective is pretty clear: documenting and interpreting the diversity of religion and religious practices in Queensland's past and present. And in doing that, we approached the State Library and sought their financial assistance in getting the project off the ground. We were applying for the Australian Research Council linkage project scheme, and that requires you to have an industry partner who's prepared to contribute cash and resources. And the State Library have been and continue to be a fantastic partner in this project right from the start. So it's a University of Queensland, State Library of Queensland partnership, as I say, bringing together history and studies in religion. I think fundamentally underpinning that was a series of objectives. I think there's a whole series of stories here that need to be better known, that we benefit as a society if these stories are better known. That's the first one. We're capturing diversity, but we're also uncovering stories that within those communities might be familiar, but outside of those communities, much less so. So capturing a sense of diversity and capturing some of the stories associated with that diversity in the past. And in that, we're seeking to do something which could be argued as a fundamental social benefit. We're seeking to boost religious literacy. That's a really important kind of set of words there. The notion that we have ordinary literacy, ordinary numeracy, but an idea of having cultural literacy, cultural understanding of other cultural traditions, and particularly an understanding of the significance of the religious traditions, both to the communities that participate in those traditions, but also the community that hosts, the larger community that hosts those traditions. So at this time, 2018, 2019, it was one of those periods in the public debate where there was examples of Islamophobia. There was an example of a highly polarising political debate about immigration, a debate that perhaps hasn't gone away. It was a volatile political subject in the everyday media. And when we went along to the State Library, it was interesting that they thought our idea was great. They thought the project was great. They were very happy to support it, and they were very willing and generous supporters. but at the same time, they were a bit delicate about this word religion. And they said to us, could you maybe call it the Atlas of Spirituality? And we went, and they said, yeah, but if it's religion, wouldn't you have to include rugby league? Because Queenslanders think that rugby league's a religion. So we had all of these sort of fundamental definitional problems early on, but also underlying that, a kind of squeamishness about the topic. They felt that religion was potentially a divisive topic, that people would be, it's a platform for ignorance and misrepresentation and misunderstanding and intolerance, prejudice. And so our job was to explain to the State Library that there is this category of human life called religion, and it's different to rugby league and the way Queenslanders love rugby league. Sure, it's a sacred activity and so on, but that bears no resemblance to any of the great faith traditions. When I say sacred, I mean powerful, personal, significant experience for people. It's a quasi-religious experience, really, being at Lang Park. It's not a religious experience. It kind of parallels a kind of participation. So I guess the key thing is explaining to the State Library the value in addressing this head on and calling it Queensland Atlas of Religion, being honest about what the focus of the project was, and also seeking to boost their collections and their ability to capture those stories and to tell their stories in their own collection. And that's when the library first really saw the value in the project, actually. I think talking to Gavin Bannerman, he said that we've had multicultural collections at the State Library for a long time. We're very happy to talk about language and festivals and food and community activities of different kinds. But he said we've always drawn the line at religion because we've never wanted to go there in case we offend people. Right? So that's the kind of tentative quality that I think has been in a lot of the public discourse around how do we handle religious diversity. There's an anxiety not to offend people. So what we've tried to do in our project is have an evidence-based approach to this. These communities exist. Their faith traditions exist as a set of beliefs, but also as a set of practices, and we're much more interested in the practices than we are in the theology or the doctrine. And so we set out to capture those stories in a format that would be suited to as broad as possible communications we could. In other words, a publicly accessible resource, not published in a book that people have to buy, but something that is there on the web for everyone to access. So you can see there a little summary of what we aimed to do, what we set out to do. The partnership with the State Library is implicit in that. But in going to the Australian Research Council, we asked for funding for the project, and UQ supported the project by funding 4 PhD scholarships. And that's the first time that had ever happened in our school. The university actually agreed to fund the scholarships themselves, rather than seeking that funding from the Australian Research Council. And that's a demonstration of how significantly UQ underwrote the project as well. It meant we didn't have to ask for as much from the Australian Research Council because UQ was already putting in significant money, all those stipends, all the PhD costs for those 4 PhD scholarships. Turns out all you have to do is ask. Sometimes people say yes. So it was a good experience for us. So the 4 PhD projects, I'll come to them in a second, but the idea is they are the beginnings of the stories of diversity and the stories, the range of faith traditions that we're seeking to capture. And I'll say a bit more about them as we go on. As I say too, at the end there, at the bottom of the page, the main outcome that we proposed and that we received the funding for was the development of a public reference website. And in that space, we had a track record in that kind of work. This is a series of projects that were initiated by myself and Peter Spirit at the University of Queensland, by Judy Powell at the Queensland Museum initially. And that produced the first of these existing websites, the Queensland Historical Atlas. And that was developed 2007, 2010, was launched in 2010, continues to be live today. And that's a partnership between the University of Queensland and the Queensland Museum. And then based on that project, Peter Spirit and Marion Stell, Marion was also involved in the Historical Atlas, but based on that project, Peter and Marion secured further funding from the Queensland Department of Premier and Cabinet to develop a series of other websites. Queensland Speaks is essentially an oral history website looking at governance, political parties, senior public officials, the judiciary and so on. There's a series of oral history interviews from the 1960s to the 1990s. There's also Queensland Places, which I don't have in the illustration there, but it's essentially a gazetteer of places in Queensland that have or have had more than 500 residents at any one time. And then Text Queensland is the University of Queensland Library's digitisation program, where a whole lot of Queensland sources have been digitised, a bit like as Trove, as Bill was saying. So we were able to present this idea as a new iteration of this existing resource. The fact that we had this digital humanities track record went a long way towards securing the funding. So this is the team. You can see Adam and I both look much younger and much fresher then than we do now. Both of us have now got beards. Both of us are now looking old and wearied as a result of this project. But you can see the number of people who came on board. Gavin Bannerman from the State Library on the bottom left of the screen. Jess White, who was a master's student in the project and was also the project administrator. And then a series of researchers, including 2 emeritus professors, Phil Armand and Peter Spirit, and then a whole range of mid-career as well as early career academics who came on board as the investigators in the project. So we assembled quite a significant team and a very diverse team in a whole range of measures, each of them bringing particular expertise to the project. So what you see from that is an interdisciplinary group. And given that it's history meets religion, clearly an interdisciplinary approach is going to be useful. Studies in religion has its own methodologies. Historical research has its own methodology. But we've also got an anthropologist, Richard Martin, involved in the project. Ryan Williams is a sociologist of religion. Val Coombs is a historical researcher as an Indigenous woman herself, with an interest in the Indigenous experience as a historical theme in the Atlas. So yes, you can see that the range of ages and the ranges of experience and the different kind of backgrounds that are represented in the project team. Final thing I'll say about that, I don't have photographs of them, but you can see the 4 PhD scholars. So Prabhuda Mukherjee is undertaking a PhD project on South Asian communities in the Brisbane area. So not just the Indian community, but also not just the Hindu community, but also a range of different faith traditions, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism, and so on, representing the South Asian community in Brisbane today. Gerald Kaperis, who came from Holland in order to take up the PhD project, he's writing a thesis on Pentecostalism. So the phenomenon of the megachurch, what we think of as the Hillsong phenomenon, he's writing a PhD on that, and particularly looking at how technology is used to generate a sense of religious mediation. So you experience a spiritual, sacred moment enhanced by technology in the context of one of the contemporary megachurches. Zera Nafsa is probably the most unexpected asset in the project. Zera's an extraordinary researcher. She came from Bangladesh, where she has worked for non-government organisations, particularly amongst the Rohingya refugee community. Zera arrived about 3 years ago, and from that moment till this, has become known in every single Muslim community in Australia in Brisbane, without fail. She's known at every mosque, she's known at every community society, she's known at every charity organisation, she's known at the football clubs that have high representation amongst Muslim youths in Queensland, and she's even a member of the Queensland Muslim Historical Society. It's quite extraordinary what Zeren has achieved in the first couple of years of being in this country. And she is doing a thesis on the multiple waves of practices of Islam that can be traced through Queensland history according to the different migration patterns. You know, the kind of Islam that's practiced by people who arrived from the Middle East in the 1970s is quite different to the practice of Islam from later African communities, for instance. So looking at how those separate waves of Islamic practice have panned out in the Brisbane context. Elverina Johnson is undertaking a master's thesis, and she's a Gunganji woman from Yarrabah. Her mother is an ordained Anglican priest, and Elverina herself, as a practicing Aboriginal Christian woman, she is also an artist, a visual artist, and a musician, as well as running her own fashion design business. So Elverina is an extraordinary personality and runs the Yarrabah Music Festival every year. And so she's writing a thesis which is really about how Indigenous culture blends elements of Christian and traditional culture in their forms of worship, but also in their forms of community expression. So the way arts work, the way music and poetry and so on is using both Christian and traditional cultural elements. And Jess White, as I mentioned before, the project manager, she's the one who did the thesis on that temple down at South Maclean. And it's the first time in Australia that someone has written a research master's thesis focused on one Hindu temple and the community dynamics of that temple, how it's founded and so on. So here's a little taste of the kinds of entries that appear, because that's the initial team, but that's not the full list of contributors. Each of those people that I've just described to you has written an entry or more than one entry as the atlas has taken shape. We've done a lot of field work. We've gone out across the state. We've done oral history interviews, and I'll come to them in a moment. But we've essentially undertaken written entries like you would find in an encyclopedia. So at the simplest level, this project is about documenting religious diversity in Queensland today and in the past via entries in an online encyclopedia that are organised according, and those entries are organised according to spaces and places. So regions of Queensland and also different kinds of spaces. So you can see there, Jennifer Crease and Michael Briner have written about the foundation of the Jewish synagogue in Brisbane in the 19th century. Jess White wrote that thesis and now an entry on the Ganesh Temple in South Maclean. And what she discovered is that there is a multi-ethnic patronage of that community. There's a Tamil presence there, there's a South Indian presence there, there's different ethnicities, if you like. There's different people from different parts of the world who practice a particular kind of Hinduism associated with that part of the world, meet together in that temple on different days of the week and annually via festivals. So it's kind of a story of a kind of a multi-ethnic sharing of a Hindu tradition. And that's why Ganesh is chosen, because Ganesh is very popular as a devotional deity with Hindu communities everywhere. John Harrison has written an entry for us on the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. Marcus Harms, who many might know, University of Southern Queensland, has written a fabulous entry on the practice of music at St John's Cathedral, and particularly the importance of a succession of music directors there. Our very own Bill Metcalf has written a fabulous entry on the Swedenborgian group, the New Jerusalem Church, which is established in 19th century Brisbane and continues today at Dutton Park. And there's a whole story of, property settlements as we go, Bill, isn't it? Buying and selling properties, but also a continuity of institutional organisation across that time frame, but a whole lot of theological diversity and change as well. So the whole Swedenborgian tradition in Brisbane has experienced a significant evolution as documented in Bill's entry. Julia Mortensen, who's one of our honoured students, now lives up on Thursday Island, has just recently moved back to Brisbane. She undertook some research for us on the Quetta Memorial Church and also set up the oral history interviews that we did up there. You can see the others. I don't need to go through all of them one by one, but that's a sample. I'll just mention the last one because Rod and Robin are in the audience. So Rod and Robin Sullivan wrote a very arresting piece for us on the role of the Queensland Irish Association in seeking to mediate sectarian tensions in the Brisbane context between Catholic and Protestant Irish. It's a really powerful entry, and it starts with the visit of Gerry Adams to Brisbane and how divisive that was, how confrontational it was. And they used that as a point of entry to then explain how the Queensland Irish Association, throughout its history, has quite deliberately set out to be a bridge between Protestant and Catholic in the Australian context, in the Brisbane context. It's a really powerful and I think a really affecting story. So yes, you can see how there's different approaches, there's different topics, and we're seeking to cast the net as broadly as possible, getting as much diversity in the character of our entries, as much as anything else. So some of these are historical, and some of them are very much contemporary, but most are a bit of a blend of both. They sort of talk about current events and current issues and current people, but also trace a deeper story of that faith tradition in the Queensland context. I mentioned the field work. We also had a wonderful opportunity to travel around the state and undertake interviews. We've finished about 18 of these, I think, now, and about probably 12 or so of them are on the website now as edited oral history interviews. One of the things that a good project does is it gives you a chance to spread your wings and learn something new. In my case, I learned how to do video editing because we had no money to employ a videographer. So this is Adam and I with our fancy cameras purchased via the project, going out to regional Queensland and setting up as if we're the news crew from the 7:30 report or something, setting up the microphones, getting the light right, and then conducting our interview. And then once we've got an hour and a half usually worth of footage, my job is to take the audio track, the video footage itself, and any other still photography we've done on site and edit it into a 10 to 12 minute video encapsulating what we learned in that oral history interview. The full interview is deposited with the State Library as part of their collection, but a version of it that's been condensed is edited in order to appear on the website. So you see here Janeth Dean at the Holland Park Mosque, Ross Parisi in North Queensland, Father George Cuff at the Abbey Museum and the Abbey Church, Dorothy and Alan from Rockhampton, Demick, so Dorothy and Alan Demick. Alan is a retired Supreme Court judge, and the two of them together, when we interviewed them, were Australia's longest serving lay preachers in the Methodist tradition. Alan had done it since he was a student in his 20s. So it's a really interesting story of that lay preacher tradition within Methodism, which then feeds into the Uniting Church. Uncle Willie Wigness is at the centre at the bottom. He's a traditional owner, a Tuareg traditional owner on Thursday Island. He's also a proud member of the Quetta Memorial Church Council. And so again, like Elverina in Yarrabah, he combines a Christian tradition and an Indigenous tradition, and he sees no conflict or dilemma in that. He's very proud of his status in both of those worlds. And the last one on the bottom right is the Bain Singh family from south of Cairns. Again, I don't think they've ever been interviewed before, but they tell this extraordinary story of a Sikh family arriving in North Queensland over decades. Initially in the 1890s, then again in the 1920s, then again in the 1940s, and so through to the 80s and the present. And so Jaswinder and Razwinder, in the image we have there, are describing a multi-generational experience of life in North Queensland. And Jaswinder is the one who contributed the land for the building of Queensland's first Sikh Gurudwara in the early 1980s. So he's telling that story with his son and his daughter-in-law. A sample of the other oral history interviews. Again, I won't go through them all, but you can see the kind of regional range. We've done interviews in Innisfail, John Lee at the Innisfail Chinese Temple. That's a temple that dates back to the colonial period. It was destroyed by a cyclone in 1918, was rebuilt. It's very interesting because if you can imagine a Chinese temple built by Italian builders in North Queensland, you get a very interesting kind of temple, right? And the other interesting thing about the Chinese temple in Innisfail, it's still an active temple, is that no one who maintains the temple themselves actually worship in the temple. It's a really interesting phenomenon. They all do it. They're all Chinese Australians, in some cases third and fourth generation Chinese Australians. They all do it in honour of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. But they themselves do not practice Chinese-style worship in that religion, in that temple. The idea of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian kind of themes combining into one space, very characteristic of Chinese worship. But they themselves don't undertake any kind of offerings or worship, but they feel it's important to maintain that in terms of their own cultural legacy. You can see there's an interview with Venerable Rinchen, who's an Australian woman who trained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And so she now works at a Buddhist centre in Cairns, and she particularly is involved in community work in palliative care. So she works on a voluntary basis in hospices and care for the terminally ill in hospital. And she tells a really interesting story about how her Buddhist practice has infused her community work in that way. The final one I'll talk about, actually, just before moving on, because I'm keeping an eye on the time, Nikolai von Tonsleman. He's not a person that anyone would have heard of, but if you do have a look at the website, which I'll show you in a minute, that would be the first oral history interview that I'd go and have a look at if I was brand new to it. This is an extraordinary story of a guy from New South Wales who, when we interviewed him, as far as we know, had not been interviewed before, but he was essentially a young man at the end of the 60s. He knew he was about to be drafted to go to Vietnam. When he got his kind of letter which told him he wasn't going to be drafted this time, but his name was still in the ring for the next time, he said, I'm not going to be here when the next time comes around. So he went to South Africa. And from South Africa, he went to Sumatra and Singapore. And he converted to Islam in South Africa, but then he converted to Hinduism in Singapore. He's also an artist. And so part of his attraction is to the aesthetics of these different religious traditions. And when he comes back to Australia after the death of his mother lives in Rockhampton, He comes back to Australia and he sells his mother's house in Rockhampton and buys land in the nearest available place where he could afford it, and that's Mount Morgan. And Mount Morgan's a very out there kind of place. Those people who know Mount Morgan, it's a mining town. It's got a different atmosphere of its own. It's got a remarkable history. It's also, in many ways, a very marginal kind of a place today with the remains of the mine and so on. And in the middle of Mount Morgan is a house with a Hindu temple in the backyard, built by Nikolai. And it's not just one temple, it's dozens of temples. He's created all of these shrines to different Hindu gods in his own backyard as an artist and a sculptor. And those shrines are now used by the Rockhampton Hindu community on a regular basis. They come to his house in order to conduct ceremonies associated with birth and marriage and funerals and so on, because they can do votive offerings to Hindu deities in the backyard of an artist in Mount Morgan. It's an extraordinary story, and it's really visual, because as an artist, he's created these amazing shrines. That was a delight to photograph and interview, as we got into that. Adam couldn't believe it. Here's a guy in North Queensland, in Central Queensland, who knows just as much about Hindu deities as he does, because Nikolai is himself an adherent to that tradition. Although over time, his art has sort of taken over, and he's now much more of a willing to talk about the power of art rather than the power of faith. In all of this, there's an important Indigenous story to tell, and I think I'll try and encapsulate that via this image of Steve Kemp, who's a Gungaloo elder at Woorabinda. We did a number of these interviews across the state with recognised traditional owner representatives. We started in Windora with Josh Gorringe and the Mythica, who we'd previously worked with and has had a close working relationship both with the State Library and with the archaeology program at UQ. Richard Martin, the anthropologist on the project, his colleagues had worked previously with Steve Kemp. And so we went up to Woorabinda and interviewed Steve Kemp, filmed him presenting essentially a welcome to country. And now we all know the convention of welcome to country. We see them at public events. What we imagined here was an opportunity for traditional owners to speak about country in a way that would explain their sense of connection to country in their own personal sense. So we're not asking them to speak on behalf of Aboriginal people. We're not asking them to explain Aboriginal spirituality. We're just asking them to provide a welcome to country as you would do. And so each of them approaches it in a very different way. For instance, Josh Gorringe, very practical country bloke. He works in the pastoral industry. He flies helicopters. He talks about the land, and he talks about the productive power of the land and also the fragility of the channel country, the way floods work, the way soils work, and so on. And just talking about it, he's giving this profound sense of what it means to him in his own lived experience, in his own consciousness, if you like. And you can't help but pick up on the spiritual dimension of that, even though it's just a country bloke talking about the land. You know what I mean? Steve, on the other hand, has a lot of cultural knowledge, and Steve talks quite explicitly about dreaming stories, about places of significance, about where his family grew up and what their particular totemic connections were, how the skin system worked in their environment and so on. So if you know nothing about Aboriginal Australia and you're coming to Queensland for whatever reason, if you find this on our website and you get interested, what we're hoping for is that people get a sense of what connection to country means for Aboriginal people today. And because of their recognition as traditional owners, as custodians, they've got a right and in some ways an obligation to present that, when needed, when called for. Likewise in Yarrabah, the Gunganji group there, Elverina Johnson, her mother, her relatives, Danny Murga and Menmini, we interviewed them, and then Elverina interviewed her mum as a separate entry, and again talking about the connection to land and waters around Yarrabah and some of the traditional knowledge that's been associated with their own upbringing. So I hope I've said enough to kind of capture the flavour of it. I can show you now what it actually looks like, because we had a long arm wrestle with the graphic designers. We had some money to pay someone to develop the website for us, and every time they came back, it was always maroon. I went, no, we don't want maroon. And they'd come back next time around, it'd be another version of maroon. I'd say, I don't know. They just got fixated on the idea of Queensland. So my main thing is, we didn't want it to be cliched, right? We didn't want it to make it like this is the true blue kind of, maroon to the core kind of. But they did favour a blue colour palette in the end once we shifted them away from the maroon. And to start with, we found it a bit strong and a bit rich. And also, to be honest, quite traditional. But over time, we kind of adjusted to that. We kind of became comfortable with that because most of the users are going to be either school students or older members of the community. That's just the reality, I think. We want to target this, particularly students doing projects under the national curriculum or under the religious studies curriculum, where they have to focus in on different kind of religion, practices of religion for assessment. But also people who are from a particular faith tradition and are interested in other faith traditions, or people who have no religious adherence at all, but are interested in different aspects of this. So it is a very traditional website. Some of my younger colleagues think that it's dating us in the process, but here it is. I'll unveil it now. That's what it looks like. And you can see it's arranged into 4 separate themes: place, tradition, story, action. By place, that section, when you click on that icon and you go into the section of the atlas that deals with place, we simply mean both physical spaces, like physical places, like a temple or a mosque, whatever, but we're also organising all of our entries according to the different regions of Queensland. And if you click onto that, which we'll do once we launch the live website, and once I show you the live website, the first thing you see is a stylised map of Queensland divided into regions. And if you're interested in a particular region, you then click on that and it takes you to all the entries for Central Queensland or for Southeast Queensland or for Brisbane, for example. So it's a way of organising the entries according to place. And the first thing that you'll also find going into that section, if you click on all, it'll have the complete list. That's the place, like the table of contents, if you like. If you want to see everything that's in the atlas, it's at the start of the place section. You click on all, and that's all of the places, which is the entire entry. Then we have 3 other themes, 3 other sections, if you like. Now, the idea of tradition, every entry relates to one or more faith traditions. And we had the interesting job of trying to work out which faith traditions are we going to use as the headlines and which ones come in as subheadings. So, for instance, there's Christianity Protestant, Christianity Catholic, and Christianity Eastern Orthodox. There's 3 different kind of headers for Christianity. Then we have Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and so on. When you break it down like that, it's interesting to kind of create a series of categories and to see that over time, whether that's expansive enough to include everybody. And what we've arrived at is a list that basically does that. An interesting example, though, we had a category Zoroastrianism, because there is a Zoroastrian community in Queensland, particularly on the Gold Coast. But there are also a number of adjacent traditions associated with Zoroastrianism that aren't actually Zoroastrian. And so we're going to replace that with Near Eastern traditions. So that's Zoroastrian, for instance, the Yazidi community in Toowoomba. We're in the process of connecting with them in order to write an entry on the Yazidi community. They would come under Near Eastern traditions rather than Zoroastrianism, for obvious reasons. So tradition is an interesting kind of classifying challenge for us that we think we've done a fairly good job. Story is just another way of saying oral history or the story of a person. So all of our oral history interviews are under that section, but so too any historical biographies. So, for example, there's an entry on, I'm just trying to recall his name now, the Anglican guy on the Darling Downs, Benjamin Glennie. So the earliest example we have of a pastoral, of a presence on the pastoral frontier of an Anglican clergyman who travels around, Benjamin Glennie, written for us by Robert Hogg. There's an example of a historical biography. Over time, we want to have all the main familiar, iconic names in Queensland religious history represented there. So, Dewey, Dunn, and so on, all the big names in Protestantism and Anglicanism, but also in the Catholic tradition. And then finally, action, because one of the things we want to draw attention to is the fact that these are communities in action. This isn't just a set of doctrines or beliefs that exist in some sort of vacuum. They're all expressed in social and community life. And often they're expressed in forms of gathering for worship or for festivals, but they're also expressed in forms of education, in forms of aged care, and in a whole range of different kinds of community activities and charity work and so on. So action is all about social action and different kinds of social action. So what I'd like you to do, if you don't mind, we can have the audience interaction part. If you wanted to scan that QR code, it'll take you straight to our website if you're that way inclined to start to have a look yourself. And you'll be able to actually go to the website. It works just as well on phones and iPads as it does on the screen of a display. So, for instance, it's very well set up on a desktop computer, but it's also configured so that it works just as well on your iPhone or your iPad. I was going to open it up myself and talk through a few of the entries, but I think I've already done a pretty good job of kind of surveying the full extent of it. And I think once people do take a chance to look at it, they'll see how each of these entries work, and also the way in which they're written in an engaging prose form that's well suited for internet reading. So we ask our contributors to kind of start with a bit of a hook, the way you'd find in journalism, and then move on to tell the story in kind of clear, fairly short paragraphs, and bring the evidence and the discussion and the detail into that, so that it really has a sense of drawing people in a sequence. I'll also just say a few things before I wrap up and maybe open up for some questions. As we look ahead, future of the project, Adam and I both plan to retire in 10 years, so we've got a succession plan, if you like. At the moment, further entries are underway. We're aiming to have an additional 10 entries every year, so we'll have 2 publication seasons, one in June, where 5 entries will appear each year, and one in December, where another 5 entries will appear. And the idea is we have a social media presence attached to those new entries. Since we launched, our usage statistics are only available for the last 2 months. We've had about 5,500 hits over the last 2 months. That's page views. And at this stage, we're not really doing much in the way of social media promotion, but the idea is we'll continue to build that up. And we also haven't sent it out via any of the teacher networks into the school system yet. So the expectation is once we start doing that through the Teachers Conference, it'll start to be known to high school teachers. It'll get a much bigger pickup amongst students doing their assignments. We do have some remaining funds for fieldwork, which we have to spend this year. And the idea is we'll conduct some further interviews and complete some more regional studies, places that we haven't been to. So we're on the lookout for good regional stories that we haven't yet covered in the Atlas. As I say, Instagram is the main vehicle for social media attached to the project, and we've started to develop a format of vertical storytelling. So we have a version of the entry told as a 1.5-minute video suited for Instagram. What's amazing is that as soon as you put something up on Instagram and you get the statistics for that, you realize that most people switch off after 8 seconds. Doesn't matter how short you make it, their attention span is already gone after 8 seconds. That's the reason why these videos are super short and super sharp, is that people just switch off and move on. But the idea is we'll continue to have a presence in that world. You know, the main focus for the Atlas will always be the website, but we're using social media as a way of drawing that in. And then finally, as I say, Adam and I are planning on retiring in 10 years' time, and we don't want this to be an albatross around the neck of anyone else. We don't want to hand this over as a burden to the next generation. So we're going to essentially archive the site after 10 years, and the plan is to talk to the State Library or other partners about having an exhibition, a museum-style exhibition, together with a publication that brings the entries together as a published book. And at that time, we will no longer add further entries. We're hoping at that time to be up to about 150 entries, and that's when we'll draw a line under it and finish. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've got a sense of the project and the outcomes. I'm happy to take any questions as well. Thank you.